Hi, everybody. So it's always those few moments of not being sure if everyone's in the room or not. So I hope lots of people are here. Welcome. I am Lynette Russell, and we are part of the Global Encounters and First Nations Peoples ARC program, 1,000 Years of Australian History at Monash University. I'm speaking to you from the lands, the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation. I am particularly on Wurundjeri country, but also I acknowledge all the other traditional owners of the countries that you would be on around Australia tonight. So welcome to our September seminar, and I'm delighted to have Dr. Alex Burchmore from the ANU, who's going to be speaking to us on Out of the Melting Pot and Into the Garden, Aboriginal-Chinese-Australian Artistic Encounters. And it's an absolute delight. We're all really thrilled with this because Alex has been a contributor to one of the things that Global Encounters has been putting together is a rather massive book, which is really actually literally in press, which is always a nice thing to say. It's with the press right now, and they've been giving us feedback, very positive feedback too. But we were also really delighted with Alex's contribution. So Alex is at the Centre for Art History and Art Theory at the Australian National University. I hope you've been not too stressed. I'm hearing it's been a rather stressful place of late, so I hope you're surviving. Alex is an art historian who specialises in the study of Chinese art, past and present, with a focus on travel and mobility, trade and exchange. Of course, you would realise that that fits beautifully in with the sort of work that we've been doing. His first book was New Export China, Translations Across Time and Place in Contemporary Chinese Porcelain Art. And I highly recommend it, not least of which for the visuals, because it's always very beautiful as well. So I'm going to get Alex as usual. Alex will speak for probably about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions. I will drop out, or at least disappear for that period of time. And thank you, Alex. Over to you. And David, you can make me disappear.
Thanks, Lynette, for that lovely introduction. I'll just get my slides. All right. Hopefully everyone can see.
Yes.
Yeah. So, as Lynette said, I'm talking today about metaphors. So I've sort of chosen a metaphor that I'm sure is familiar with everyone, the melting pot, as a jumping off point, as something to move away from, perhaps. And then the garden is something that I've been thinking about mostly since visiting Our Story, which I'll talk a little bit about soon at the exhibition at the National Museum of Australia. Really got me thinking about market gardens, but also about gardens in general as a metaphor for encounter and exchange and cultural meetings and contact. So I'll get into it. And here's a nice picture of, well, a picture of part of Our Story for those who haven't had the chance to see it yet. It's on until January, so there's a bit of time to get down to Canberra and have a look if you haven't had a chance yet. Metaphors of cooking and eating are a perennial favourite among writers on multiculturalism. No comment on cultural contact seems complete without mention of the proverbial melting pot, implying a balanced mix of diverse ingredients, each adding a unique flavour to the dish, but ultimately merging with the whole. The work of contemporary art, personal reflections on cultural inheritance, and rich selection of archival photographs brought together for Our Story at the National Museum offer another metaphor. While the melting pot isn't entirely absent, a potentially richer analogy, I think, arises from the display itself in the equally time-honoured image of the market garden. And I've got a quote here from the landmark anthology Lost in the Whitewash, edited by Penny Edwards and Shen Yuanfang, published back in 2003, which I think enacts a similar, in their words, dislocation of the Anglo-Celtic from the centerfold of Australian historiography, and exposes a bipolar discourse, again in their words, in which discussions of the so-called Chinese question and the Aboriginal problem were conducted almost entirely without reference to one another. In that volume, they invite challenges to this discourse, encouraging a conceptual overhaul of the spaces within and between which Australia can be imagined, and significantly, they identified writers and artists as the most likely innovators in this reorientation, So this was very much in my mind when I was walking through our story, and I was thinking about when I first read this, and that point in time was when I was working on an article about Guan Wei's ceramics and about his interactions or his engagement, I guess, his encounters with Aboriginal Australian culture. And those ceramics as a case study in what I still think is his infrequently acknowledged use of Aboriginal Australian-inspired motifs. Those ceramics provide one example, I think, of such an overhaul, creating an idiosyncratic, even perhaps an exotic vision of Australia in which white Australians, like myself, are either entirely absent or appear as malign intruders. Like the 18th century fashion for chinoiserie, inspired by the porcelain manufactured in China for global export, I argued in that article that what I called the Australery aesthetic in Guan Wei ceramics creates a vision of cross-cultural exchange that blurs fact and fiction, Orient and Occident. Rather than simply reversing the terms of this binary by privileging East over West, however, Guan Wei has displaced the Western subject in a vision of Australia that's entirely of his own making. This vision has roots in his previous work, but it's received little attention relative to his fusion of Chinese and European iconographies, or his imaging of migrant identity. Turning away from that East-West binary, I think that his Australery uncovers a less well-known site of encounter between different peoples and cultures. Thinking more about chinoiserie too, against traditional understandings of that term and that style, David Porter has notably sought to redefine it as what he thinks of as an antidote to stereotype and convention, even paradoxically as it endorsed fantasies of a mysterious Orient, capable of inspiring both awe and absurdity. In contrast to the classical taste and the polite bourgeois culture of 18th century England, Porter has argued that chinoiserie promoted a celebration of surface splendor and a mirage of visual delights that could only deceive and lead the viewer astray, resisting any essentializing impulse and revealing an essence that is itself a pastiche, a guiding principle not of purity and integrity, but of boundless adaptability. Porter goes on to explain that this guiding principle was an ideal vehicle for what he terms an experimental self-fashioning, founded not on a preordained inheritance or an immutable essence, but on cultural permutation, plurality, and an aesthetic subject cut loose from naturalized hierarchies. In a similar manner, Guan Wei's Australery ceramics resist the persistent tendency to reduce his work to an expression of an essentialized Chineseness for white Australian viewers, giving precedence instead to an iconographic vocabulary in which the authority that these viewers conventionally enjoy is displaced by a recognition of more pluralistic cultural realities. At the same time, the application of this vocabulary to the historically exotic medium of porcelain amplifies its allure and appropriates the vision of China as blue and white pagodas to Guan Wei's own vision of Australia as the ancient land of the dreaming, in his words. This is one of the ceramics here, which I'll talk a bit more about soon. Going back into his quite substantial body of work, he's long expressed a fascination for Australia as a cultural landscape defined by geographic vastness, an unforgiving climate, and great antiquity. He recalls an exhibition of Australian landscape paintings on loan to the National Art Museum of China and a screening of Picnic at Hanging Rock in the early 1980s as formative touchstones for his impressions of this wild and different extraordinary country. These sentiments were expressed in his first significant Australian body of work, the Living Specimen series of acrylic paintings on canvas. Although these are generally characterized by a juxtaposition of Chinese and European motifs, one canvas in the series, which I've got here on the left for me, this canvas presents a duck at the bottom in a style that seems inspired by Aboriginal Australian visual vocabularies, hovering below an unhatched egg preserved in a beaker, perhaps to contrast an earthy authenticity with a lifeless specimen of scientific study. The watery blues throughout the series have also been cited as an expression of the new awareness of coastline, water, and distance that Guan Wei gained while in Tasmania, which he referred to as an island in a vast ocean of nothingness. Even at this early stage in his career, the qualities of his Australery were starting to appear: the wonder of open spaces, the mystic isolation of ocean solitude, and the coveted authenticity of Aboriginal flora and fauna. He then further elaborated these ideas in Treasure Hunt in 1995 again emphasizing the landscape and its inhabitants. Treasure Hunt marked a departure from his previously muted palette for much more vivid blue and red-brown tones that recall the hues of the desert and a brightness that emulates the brilliant intensity of a cloudless sky. These sunburnt desert scenes are imbued with additional local familiarity by a cast of lizards, kangaroos, crocodiles, snakes, platypuses, and other Australian fauna, juxtaposed again with products of machine technology. And each painting in the series narrates an episode in the pursuit of a pill-like capsule that always remains just out of reach, an analogy perhaps for Guan Wei's own desire to capture the elusive essence of the continent and his belief that this could provide an elixir for his curiosity. His attempts to map this climate have found their most encyclopedic expression in his cartographic representations of fictional but vaguely familiar continents. In Dao Island from 2002, crocodiles, emus, and other Antipodean creatures traverse a fractured archipelago, their optimism in the face of aridity intended to reflect, in his words, the environment of Australia and the Australian spirit. Guan Wei's evocative labelling of the land masses in this work, the enchanted coast, trepidation, aspiration, and so on, have prompted many to associate it with the hope of sanctuary, driving those who seek asylum on our shores. But it can also be read as an essay in the imagining of another Australia, an exotic island nation adrift in a vast, impossibly blue ocean, teeming with strange, composite creatures. And it's also in Guan Wei's cartographic canvases that Aboriginal figures first enter his work as black silhouettes, running, dancing, and hunting. In Trepidation Continent from 2003, one of many works with militaristic overtones that critics have associated with John Howard's draconian immigration policies, two men in the center of the landmass brandish spears and small shields. They're shown chasing a pair of kangaroos, ignoring the battalions of soldiers, disembodied sentinels, warships bristling with guns, helicopters and boats overflowing with human cargo that surround them. A culminating event for Guan Wei's Australia was his participation in 2006 in an expedition organised by 24 Hour Art and Injalak Arts and Crafts. And this was his first experience of the bush, and it really left a deep impression, recorded in the series A Mysterious Land from 2007. Reflecting on this expedition in an article that he published afterwards in Artlink, he wrote of the curiosity, mystery, and strangeness that Aboriginal culture had held for him since arriving in Australia, and the excitement with which he seized this opportunity, in his words, to go deep into Aboriginal territory. The camp inspired mixed feelings for him of terror and sublime insignificance. He recalls, "Our camp was in a grove, my tent underneath a crooked tree. The sound of the wind, the water, and the strange cries coming from I do not know what kind of animals filled me with both fear and a feeling of awe. The formidable force exuding from this wilderness made me think of Australia in colonial times, when forests and plains were harsh, savage, cruel, and deserted places." In A Mysterious Land, he translated these experiences into an intimate version of his aerial cartographies, lavishing great care on the gnarled branches and dense canopies of eucalyptus trees. Aboriginal silhouettes run among towering anthills, while terrifying animal-human hybrids linger at the edges of the composition, in what he called the darksome and hazy forest kingdom of Pan, the half-man, half-goat, who would frighten people with his screams. Each of these core qualities of Guan Wei's Australia, his fascination with the expansive isolation of arid desert and measureless ocean, the wonder inspired by unfamiliar plants and animals, the earthy authenticity that he found in Aboriginal culture, and the disruptive effects of an encounter with invading or colonizing forces, these all appear in his ceramics of 2012 and 2014. These are two selections from his first body of work in ceramics, 15 porcelain plates and 8 vases collectively titled Subdued Demons, all of which are unapologetically eclectic and experimental. They were created during a 2-week stay in the city of Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province in southeastern China, once the porcelain capital of the world, with his friend, fellow artist Wang Lifeng. Guan Wei recalls this as an opportunistic foray into an unfamiliar material inspired by its growing popularity among artists inside and outside China, which I also talk about in my book, which Lynette kindly mentioned at the start, New Export China. Before leaving Beijing, he had created a series of sketches in his signature style, many derived from his earlier works, while others introduced themes that appear again in later, more developed ceramic pieces. Some of these include the silhouetted figures first seen in his aerial cartographies, a serpentine dragon, a leaping cane toad, an eerily disembodied head in profile, one eye closed and lips pursed in concentration, distorted kangaroos emerging from swarms of zoomorphic amoeba, floating ships, and a cast of angelic and demonic messengers, sometimes alone, sometimes in conflict. These are tentative works with no relation between motifs and no coherent narratives. Guan Wei's fascination with antiquity is given clearest expression in To the Origin, the most abstract of the 4 porcelain series that he created during 2 trips to Jingdezhen in 2014, and Blue Like Sky. These expeditions were more organized, they were longer in duration, allowing a considered engagement with the medium in resolved, 3-dimensional compositions. The meandering, perforated lines, concentric circles, sweeping graphic arrows, and enumerated groups of dots adorning these mouthless vessels establish continuity with the cartographic and astrological symbols that first appeared in his paintings, transforming the milky white surface of the porcelain into a map of the stars. Figures, faces, composite creatures, and esoteric diagrams become astrological constellations. In Blue Like Sky, another series of 8 vessels, he further developed this cartographic or astrological iconography, but these pieces are more densely ornamented and less formally ambiguous, with a narrow neck, sloping shoulders, and a defined base that suggests functional intent. Guan Wei's repertoire of otherworldly figures and faces is further elaborated while dots and lines recede. The astrological connotations of his menagerie are reinforced by references to Greek myth, including a rearing centaur, seen here on Blue Like Sky number 6, and a hieratic scorpion on Blue Like Sky number 7. His combination of these with the stereotypically Chinese dragon, crane, and fish could be read as a juxtaposition of East and West, but this reading is complicated by the inclusion of more ambiguous schematic designs. On the shoulder of the first vessel in the series, a diminutive figure stands on a monstrous bird reduced to the essential elements of wings, claws, and projecting head, and on the third, the silhouettes of a warthog-like creature and a figure with arms outstretched converge between a trapezoidal diagram and a strand of DNA, while the final vessel teems with zoomorphic plankton extending their legs in probing curiosity. The narrative aspect of Guan Wei's complex iconography, which is a little more difficult to see in Blue Like Sky and completely absent, I think, in To the Origin, really comes to the fore in Extraordinary World. These vessels seem to recount a mythic journey undertaken by a race of insect-like humans, frustrated by demonic creatures and monstrous amoeba, but watched over by a heavenly host of trumpeting angels. On the 4th vessel in the series, an adult child and dog appear stranded, while overhead a boat crests a sinuous wave, and on the 7th, seen here on the left, a group of figures row a ship toward the setting sun across tranquil seas, while beneath them a gigantic amoeba-like form surges to the surface with its leech-like offspring. On the 8th, on the right, 3 hieratic figures stand on a grotesque chimera, its clawed feet propelling them across a landscape of pale blue graphic sweeps, one of which cleaves the creature in 2. In each scene, neither destination nor origin are clearly located. It's their movement that becomes important, the mythic symbolism of the journey as a metaphor for passage not only across space, but across time and across different states of being. Even the medium of their voyage is ambiguous, variously aquatic, aerial, and terrestrial. As in all mythic forms, meaning becomes modular and open-ended, inviting the viewer to reinterpret and to rearrange the narrative. Wonderland and Land of the Dreaming, Guan Wei's final porcelain series, are also the most coherent in composition and content, further refining his preoccupation with an exclusively Aboriginal Australian-inspired repertoire. The composition of Wonderland number 8, for example, reproduces his aerial cartographies in miniature, while other vessels are painted with vignettes of Aboriginal figures, running, standing, or hunting in the landscape, surrounded by eucalyptus trees and native animals. The ambiguity of his understanding of the dreaming as a primordial space of creation is absent, superseded by a terrestrial vision of Australia interspersed with silhouette portraits of Aboriginal men. Guan Wei imbues these scenes with a lingering menace and melancholy, embodied in the seemingly incongruous addition of European ships and the silhouette of a man in military uniform. But this meeting of worlds isn't framed as a colonial imposition. Their encounter is one of mutual curiosity, not dispossession. So these vessels represent the moment, perhaps, when the visitor must choose between peaceful coexistence or a show of force that compels the other to submit. Although significant for their quantity and their transposition of his signature style to a new medium, neither Guan Wei's ceramics nor his adaptation throughout his career of Aboriginal Australian-inspired motifs have received really much critical attention at all. As the most prominent representative of what's called the post-Tiananmen generation of Chinese emigres who arrived in Australia after 1989, the reception of his art has instead been consistently tied to a multiculturalism that foregrounds his combination of Chinese and Australian or European iconographies. His otherworldly figures adrift in dense spaces of iconographic collision have inspired endless meditations on the migrant experience, and they're regularly used to illustrate Chinese-Australian ties. Guan Wei's Australian ceramics expose the stereotypes that structure our understandings of cultural identity. A review of the writing inspired by his work over the past couple decades reveals a preference for two interpretive viewpoints that focus on his relevance for mainstream multicultural politics. The most persistent of these, symptomatic perhaps of the political climate in which he first gained recognition, casts him as an interlocutor for his heritage and his art as a gateway to Chinese culture, while the second shifts focus to his experiences as a migrant. Guan Wei is reduced, in both cases, to a genial door guardian, in the words of one writer, who can explain the stories of one world to the other. These perspectives obscure his Australian by forcing his work to conform with the binary politics of inclusion and exclusion that define the white Australian national space. This space has developed in several phases since Federation, tied to continuous moments in the process of national self-imaging. Yet a consistent emphasis has endured through all stages of development on what Ghassan Haj terms the white nation fantasy, a belief in the centrality of white Australians as enactors of the law in Australia, or to put it differently, as governors of the nation and of ethnics, in his words, as people one can make decisions about, objects to be governed. As expressions of this belief, both white racism and white multiculturalism are not opposed. It is not simply a divide between good, tolerant people and bad, intolerant people, Haj explains, but rather a difference in capacity of tolerance between people who equally claim to manage national space. Both are effects of what he calls white paranoia, anxiety among white Australians that irrepressible cultural forces will dissolve a self-given right to decide the limits of national inclusion. Haj names Aboriginal genocide and isolation from Europe as two sources for this paranoia, the former imposing a constant reminder of the uglier aspects of the colonial past, while the latter intensifies a fear of being swamped by a hostile and uncivilized otherness. When these points of tension meet, and especially when they meet outside the white Australian national space, an unsettling subversion is inevitable. The image of the melting pot, which I mentioned at the start, though usually benign in intent, is nevertheless perfectly suited for such fantasies of containment, control, and assimilation. While we now associate this metaphor with visions of broth, stew, or perhaps a fondue, when used in the early 20th century, the phrase was intended to suggest an alchemical blending of base metals in a crucible. The legendary turning of lead into gold stands in here for a desired conversion of the foreign into the familiar. The melting pot symbol came into general usage following the presentation in 1908 of Israel Zangwill's play of the same name. Several factors might help explain why it had such impact and why it found such rapid and enduring popularity. First, there was a rise in immigration in the US between 1900 and 1914, provoking a lot of public discussion of the so-called immigration problem, which became involved in practically all the political and social issues of the time. The play was popular, the title was known to hundreds of thousands who never saw it performed, the times seemed to require discussion of immigration, and there arose a need for a handy and generally accepted symbol for the whole complicated business. Zangwill's vision of the United States as a melting pot, a place where old world nationality drops away and various elements fuse into a new nationality, serves as a general framework within which the drama of his Jewish protagonist is enacted. David Quixano, a young Jewish immigrant whose family has been murdered in the Kishinev massacre of 1903, is a composer at work on a great American symphony that will capture in music the vast racial and ethnic harmony he envisions arising in America. David falls in love with Vera, a settlement house worker from Russia. Vera is a Christian, but they resolve to marry following David's conviction that in America, immigrants must cast off their inherited attitudes, loyalties, and prejudices. And then David learns, tragically, that Vera's father is the very Russian officer who directed the massacre, and in his revulsion, he breaks off his romance with her, thus betraying in his own mind the ideal of the melting pot. After suffering remorse for this lapse, he's eventually reunited with Vera in the last scene, immediately after a triumphant performance of his American symphony, and the play ends with this ode of praise and hope for the melting pot as David and Vera stand on the roof of the settlement house, transfixed by the vision of the Statue of Liberty, gilded by the sunset. In my paper that I've been drawing from when I was looking at Guan Wei ceramics, I highlighted two interpretive models, two other metaphors for Guan Wei's Australian that reinforce its resonance with the aesthetics of the exotic. The first of these was based on a comparison drawn by Jeremy Barmay between the artist's apparent fascination with otherness and the codified appreciation of rarities, oddities, fascinations, artifices, and ephemera in Wunderkammer, or cabinets of curiosity. This is perhaps the image that is closest to that of the melting pot, with its implications of alchemical mystery and the recreation in microcosmic miniature of grand cosmic and mythological dramas. The second analogy was curator Natalie King's comparison of Guan Wei's obscurantist compositions with folly, an absurd structure that connotes delight, terror, and ecstasy. For both critics, it is Guan Wei's creation of an alternate world that imbues his art with such mystery, compelling a recognition of unexplored spheres of the imagination. The composite creatures, fragments of narrative, and parodies of rationalist symbolic codes that adorn his plates and vessels conjure visions of another world, painstakingly replicated in miniature. In my paper, I focused on the resonance of the cabinet of curiosity, but for today I'd like to go down the path not taken and think further about the analogy of the folly. Such structures were an essential feature of what was known as the Jardin Anglo-Chinois, a combination of the English landscape garden and what were then perceived to be the defining qualities of Chinese garden design that gained popularity in 18th century France. Bianca Maria Rinaldi has traced the development of such gardens and their envisioned Chinese models, first as an evocation of the natural landscape, then as the image of the countryside, later as a choreography of varied sequences, and finally in a derogatory way as a deformation of nature, mirroring changing European perceptions of China. Across all these shifts in cultural valuation, however, the Anglo-Chinese garden retained a close connection with ideas of naturalness, irregularity, variety, and proximity to the rural landscape. As such, they provided a flexible foil for homegrown principles of garden design and the social, cultural, and political values that these were seen to embody. Thus, the Chinese garden was more than a context. In Rinaldi's words, it was a pretext, used to discuss ethical and political questions and the complex and contradictory relationship between the West and China. Perhaps it can also serve then as a pretext to discuss Aboriginal Chinese encounters. There's a precedent for this in Guan Wei's engagement at various points in his career with botanical themes, as seen most notably in his series Exotic Flowers and Rare Grasses. Chinese and Australian flora are fused in this series of pseudo-botanical illustrations of fictional plants, each ascribed medical properties in code at the bottom of the canvas. Like the capsule and treasure hunt, these hybrid specimens are unattainable products of a climate that exists only in the artist's imagination. Like other aspects of Guan Wei's practice, they've been interpreted as representing a union of East and West, embodying the process of melding what is known from the past and what is newly discovered into a strong, vital, and workable whole. But for me, they speak as well to the boundless irregularity and variety of the natural world as imagined in the Anglo-Chinese garden, and to the adaptability, permutation, and plurality of Guan Wei's Australian aesthetic. These idiosyncratic combinations exceed any attempt to control and contain their experimental self-fashioning, generating an ecological vision of complex coexistence rather than enforced harmony. Another precedent could be noted in the occasional evocation of gardens and plants more generally as the inspiration or the guiding theme for exhibitions of work by artists of multiple cultural backgrounds. Harvest, an exhibition about plants and place at the Museum of Economic Botany in Adelaide, South Australia, for example, back in 2009, brought together work by a wide range of past and present artists and makers to explore the curious and sometimes surprising relationship between plants, place, and culture. The curator Peter Emmett sought above all to draw attention with this theme to the history of the venue itself as the world's last colonial economic botany museum, itself contained within Adelaide's colonial botanic garden, as part of a larger history of colonial encounter with and exploitation of local natural resources. He notes in the exhibition text, for example, the origins of the museum as the government's first significant investment to engage colonists in the opportunities to exploit new food, fibre, timber, and medicinal plants for their own wealth and the wealth of the colony and Britain. At the same time, however, Emmett was keen to explore the divergence in the nature of the relationship that Indigenous peoples and European settlers had with plants, as well as larger themes of cultural difference and the entwinement of nature and culture. Through acknowledging such difference, he argues, we can find self, identity, belonging, and a sense of place. Alongside works of colonial art and material culture, like the elaborate botanical ornaments in silver confected by the museum's first director, Julius Schomburg, the exhibition also showcased work by Indigenous artists including Clifford Possum Jabuljari, Mungarawi Yunupingu, Albert Namatjira, and Emily Kame Kungwarai, as well as contemporary artists of diverse heritage, notably Angela and Hussein Balmanesh and Asien. I find Emmett's comment here on the exhibition itself as a garden to be especially inspiring, although notably his thoughts on Asien's human bust very much align with the multiculturalist presentation of Guan Wei's work. The artist is again cast as a representative of Chinese culture, while a potentially more transgressive reading of the wild and unruly floral profusion engulfing this figure as an analogue for cultural mobility remains unspoken. A third precedent that sprang to mind while I was preparing this talk is the exhibition Culture Graft that Melissa Chu curated for Foray Centre for Contemporary Asian Art back in '98, bringing together works by Guan Wei, Asien, and Wang Zhiyuan. As this quote from the exhibition text shows, Chu as well found inspiration in the botanical and specifically the act of grafting, the coming together of two separate strands which meld and grow together to become one. For Chu, this presented an analogy in nature of the social processes of acculturation experienced by the three artists following their relocation from China to Australia. But again, I can't help but feel this metaphor could have been pushed even further to move away from figures of melding and blending toward images of uncontrolled growth, experimental profusion, and ecological entanglement. I find such ideas powerfully embodied in Wang Zhiyuan's metamorphic 2 from 1 series, illustrated in the exhibition text, but not included, I believe, in the exhibition itself. Notably, the work by Guan Wei that was included in Culture Graft, his 1998 installation Glory Family, consisting, in Chu's words, of fake pink sausages resting on white cotton cushions, each lit by a single desk lamp, and giving the impression that we're viewing important specimens or museum objects, draws attention to the role of food in histories of cultural exchange. Chu links this work with his earlier painting series, The Great War of the Eggplant from 1993, in which the transplanted Chinese vegetable becomes a food, a weapon, and an aesthetic object, offering at the same time a parody of the relationship between food, family, and cultural identity in Chinese society. It's a short walk from the kitchen to the garden, but as metaphors for cultural contact, the two are miles apart. While the former suggests a one-way process of selection, preparation, mixing, cooking, and consumption, the garden is a place for setting down roots, grafting and pruning, nurturing and cultivating, and for preserving the seeds of future growth after the fruits of the present have been harvested and enjoyed. This analogy is clearest in our story, to get back to the exhibition that inspired me on this, in the pairing of curator and artist Zhou Xiaoping's Chinese cabbage leaves with his handwritten mapping of the Ahan family tree, facing each other on opposite walls of the gallery. Zhou's cabbage leaves, reproduced in jade and ochre-tone glass, immediately called to mind, for me, a comparably sweeping installation of glass coulamons created at the Canberra Glassworks by Nyambri Ngunnawal artist Paul Girawa House and glass artist Tom Roney, and shown at the Canberra Museum and Gallery in late 2024. Both seek to cast a humble and familiar object in a more spectacular form, and both accomplish at the same time an elegant grafting of cultural experiences. Both works also foreground the embedding of cultural experiences within a larger ecology of intertwined social and natural rhythms. Coulemons, usually formed using bark rather than glass, work with the natural curvature of a tree's trunk, hardened and molded over fire to create a shallow vessel that can be used to dig, to clear vegetation, to hold food or water, or to cradle a newborn baby. Zhou's Chinese cabbage leaves, on the other hand, offer a poetic homage to the history of the market garden as a vital cultural landscape within not only Chinese-Australian, but also Chinese Aboriginal encounter and exchange. As detailed in the substantial text published to accompany our story, Chinese and Aboriginal gardeners frequently worked alongside each other in these cultivated plots, sharing knowledge and experience in relation to the land. The blurring of social and natural, or artifact and ecofact, is something that I recently explored in a very different context in a chapter for the forthcoming handbook of global oceanic encounters that Lynette mentioned in her opening remarks. Reflecting on the historic trope of sinicization in histories of encounter and exchange between China and Southeast Asia, and focusing specifically on the ceramics recently salvaged from the Temasek wreck off the coast of Singapore, in that chapter, I propose that objects like this on the screen, conventionally termed sea sculptures, can offer another alternative metaphor for cultural contact. Very briefly, sinicization is a long-held, I guess, another metaphor that sees the transmission of Chinese cultural influence throughout Southeast Asia as a linear, one-way diffusion, rather than what I see it as more of a kind of adaptive network of different points of contact. And I thought that sea sculptures, sea sculptures too, are an organic product of the processes of incrustation that have preserved the ceramics from which they form. So they form around ceramics in salvaged shipwreck cargoes. In the case of the Temasek wreck, for 700 years. While conservationist convention dictates that these concretions must be removed before the real historical work can begin, there are many occasions when the artifact, the human-made aspect, and the ecofact, the naturally occurring aspect, cannot be so easily divided. Such fusions of specimen and sediment suspend the distinctions between human and more than human, resisting straightforward classification. Against that centripetal logic of sinicization, I argue that these creative fusions embody a model of encounter founded instead on reciprocal growth and organic incrustation. The potentially transgressive implications of this possibility are especially clear in this particular sea sculpture, now in the collection of the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Acquired at the turn of the millennium, this amorphous congeries of marine life, sediment, fossilized bone, stone, corroded iron, and ceramic coalesced in the wrecked remains of a trading vessel that sank off the coast of Vietnam, near the port city of Hue An, during the 15th century. When it was shown in the exhibition Lost at Sea, Art Recovered from Shipwrecks in 2019, curators and reviewers alike noted with delight that the exposure of the sculpture to air had caused some of its constituent materials to disintegrate. And in the object entry for the museum's online collection database, this oxidization is framed in terms recalling the separation of sediment from salvaged ceramics in a conservation laboratory. Less congregation conduces here to more significance, with those components not shaped by human hands rationalized as a prelude to its reconversion into discrete artifacts for cleaning, classification, cataloging, and display. But if the more than human aspects of the sculpture are given precedence, then its slow disintegration could also signal the vitality of the matter from which it's composed. The long process of sedimentation and incrustation through which it has evolved over the centuries, simultaneously made and grown, manufactured and organic, and artificial and natural, here plays out in real time. The composition becomes a work of performance art in which the human stories of oceanic discovery, commercial speculation, and tragic loss are superseded by a tangible enactment of transubstantiation and elemental displacement, material transcendence, and slow revelation. The model of encounter that this can embody stands in contrast to both the centripetal logic of sinicization as well as the homogeneous blending of the melting pot. This is a model founded in the careful study of more than human agency through the material traces that mark its passage, transgressing human perspectives on chronology and cultural identity. Encounter, according to this model, is profoundly relational and reciprocal. It crystallizes and accumulates over time, entangling and encrusting until the dividing lines that once appeared to separate discrete individuals and communities are irreversibly overgrown. These remains compel a recognition of the larger ebb and flow of cultural currents, the tides of social, political, and individual events, and the universal law of entropy, a ceaseless process of creative decay and unpredictable fusions in which we are all alike immersed. Getting back to our story, the exhibition seems, to me, deliberately designed to inspire these energizing juxtapositions. Its location in the museum's First Australians gallery is marked by a conspicuous fringe of red paper lanterns, punctuated with woven grass dilly bags. This variation on the Chinatown theme is then taken up again by Gulamerjan Larkia Wardaman and Karijari artist Jenna Lee in the dilly bag lanterns created in rice paper and woven silk for her installation and photographs to light up. Portraits of some of the many individuals of mixed Aboriginal and Chinese heritage who have participated in the larger research project on which the exhibition draws ensure an emphasis on the personal throughout. Their words, reproduced on the gallery wall and in the substantial exhibition text, as well as their voices recorded for the documentary footage playing on screens throughout the space, narrate a history from below. Or to extend the garden metaphor, from the grassroots. This is a history that is very much alive, continually in process of discovery and rediscovery, animated by family ties and family tales that offer vital protection and solidarity. The works of contemporary art shown amongst this wealth of archival and testimonial material, like Zhou's Chinese cabbage leaves, offer points of focus that crystallize central themes. Kuri artist Lloyd Gawura Hornsby's paintings in acrylic on canvas, New Beginnings and Coming to Australia, for example, bring together archetypal images of gold and opal mining, tuna fishing, Uluru, and the Great Wall, with portraits of his great-grandfather James Ahoy, and the infamous anti-immigration caricature of the Chinese octopus, all united in a shimmering field of dots. New bonds and older connections, long denied or erased in official accounts, are established and celebrated in these works. So in contrast to the melting pot vision of multicultural diversity as a succulent meal of exotic dishes awaiting consumption, our story draws attention to the complex layering of culture as a lived experience of multiple affinities and connections. Chinese and Aboriginal heritage is celebrated here, not as calculated percentages or assigned labels, but as dimensions of family history and personal meaning, to be tended, nurtured, and above all, to be shared. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. I'm really, really looking forward to getting myself to Canberra to see that exhibition, if nothing else. Well, we'll leave your screen up for the moment because people may want to ask questions about specific images. So perhaps we'll just leave it for the moment. Everybody on Zoom, please feel free to pop into the chat if you have a question that you'd like to ask Alex. I've got a few myself I'm really quite keen to hear from. I mean, Phil, incredible, as I was saying to Alex a few minutes ago before we started, very lucky to have just recently read the book and really spent a lot of time thinking about our story, which is the name of the exhibition that's currently on in Canberra. And it is, I highly recommend the book and I'm sure the exhibition. One of the things, Alex, I was going to mention is I had the very fortunate opportunity recently of having a personal communications that came from Gary Lee, who is an artist who is, I'm going to actually quote this because I want to get it absolutely right, who is an artist who confronts themes of masculinity and beauty through his shared lens of Larrakia, Wardaman, Filipino, Chinese, Scottish, and German origins, which is just fabulous. And he noted that the exhibition, Our Story in particular, was refreshing to see the Aboriginal and Chinese stories acknowledged and the stories given a conceptual and imaginative platform. And he noted, and this is what I wanted to really sort of pick up and maybe have a conversation about, this is Gary Lee speaking. It's a subject of great interest to me as an artist of Aboriginal and Asian heritage. And as I continue to learn more, in particular about my own family histories relating to those Aboriginal and Chinese ancestors from Australia's northern frontier. And it comes through your discussion tonight, that it's not merely a story about, it sort of operates on multiple levels, doesn't it? So it's not just a story about Chinese people in Australia, nor is it just a story about Chinese people and Aboriginal people interacting and coming together. But it also operates on that sort of that, as you've mentioned, that personal level, the family, the familial stories that come through as well. It's very powerful stuff, and I'm so grateful that you've been able to unpick a little bit of it here tonight. I wonder if I can ask a specific. I must admit, my head is still spinning about the idea of Guan Wei seeing Picnic at Hanging Rock in China. My brain is like, what was that like? That must have been quite something. But I'm just wondering if you might talk a little bit, or at least explore the notion of the depth of history. I mean, we all know that the Chinese, many Chinese arrived in Australia with the gold rushes,
Mm.
and it's probably, we're what we're looking at now is a relatively contemporary engagement with
Mm.
Aboriginal and Chinese, but they obviously go back much further than that. Have you seen evidence of that in your work on the art?
Of the depth of history, the
Yeah,
sort
the
of.
depth of historical interactions.
Hmm, that's a tricky question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be tricky.
No, no, I'm just thinking that I could. I mean, I suppose it comes out in a lot of the works in our story. It's sort of a presence throughout, and I mean, it's the way that it treats time is another thing that I thought was quite interesting because it's sort of it echoes back into the depth of history, into some of the um, like the long established connections and the long established genealogies and lineages and reverberations throughout the historical record, or it picks up on some of those loose threads as well, which haven't really been followed in the
Yeah.
historical record, and that comes through in a lot of the works. But the way that it treats it, it's sort of in a sense that it's a present depth of history, or it's a depth that kind of comes through in the contemporary. That it's something that's not perhaps uh, languishing in the past, but it's something that kind of finds expression in the contemporary works and finds expression and contemporary resonance and relevance in those works. And that's something I mean that I've seen in a lot of other works by Guan Wei, by RCN too, is that way that particularly when using not only in imagery but also in certain materials or in certain kind of stylistic approaches where you have that intermingling of different times and different places across time and the passages between those. So I would say definitely yes. I sort of found in a lot of the art I look at that depth of history really comes through, but in a way that's very complex and very much tied to the contemporary. I would say. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, it does. Thank you. I'm guessing, and this is Zhao's work, and I've apologize if I'm not pronouncing it quite right, but Zhao's work really is a f- not so much the work that's in that, not the beautiful cabbage leaves, but some of his earlier
Mm,
work
mm,
definitely tests those boundaries between almost what we might say between inspiration and appropriation.
mm,
And as a consequence is quite contentious in some circles and extremely celebrated in others. So I don't want to make
mm,
it sound negative by any means. But the work that he did in particular with Johnny Bullen and and I'm thinking of this one in we had the very fortunate opportunity to go to Zal's studio not a couple of years ago, and he took us through the collection and took us through some of the things that he'd been doing. And in particular, there's
mm,
the very famous the portrait of Johnny Bullen with the
mm,
which Johnny has contributed to by doing the cross hatching and essentially the bark painting component of this really quite, I think, really extraordinary piece of work. But it's not universally accepted.
mhm.
It does raise concerns for some, which, as I say, gets us to that nub of when is it appropriation and when is it um, homage or inspiration.
No, it's definitely it's a question that's that crops up across Zhou Xiaoping's career. And I mean, it could be directed at some of Guan Wei's imagery too. In the article, I go more into the obvious visual links between those silhouettes and Tommy McRae's drawings, and the possibility that he might have drawn some inspiration from that, and in particular contexts that might be seen in another light, perhaps. And I'm very conscious that as an English Australian man, it's not up to me to decide, what's appropriation and what's genuine collaboration and communication. But I mean, it might perhaps speak in Zhou Xiaoping's case too. And I know that Marsha Langton has been a fierce defender of him for many
Absolutely.
years and has spoken on his behalf. It might perhaps be another case of that national space being policed by some people,
Mm-hmm.
not from Aboriginal communities necessarily, but from other communities, deciding that the interaction between Chinese or Chinese Australian artists and Aboriginal artists is perhaps beyond the realms of decorum, or is something that can't be tolerated, perhaps. But it's perhaps speaks to the complexity of such interactions and encounters and potential transgressiveness, that they can open up new ways of communicating across boundaries and new ways of drawing inspiration from each other and that kind of thing. But it's definitely, yeah, I mean, it also speaks to the uh, the difficulty, not the challenges, I guess, inherent in encounters too, and the need to really work carefully across those lines and consider protocols and things like that.
Yeah. I just remind the audience, please, if you've got a question, please do pop it in the. I can't see anything, nothing's come up yet, but I do really hope others might, because I don't want to dominate. But I think it's it is an utterly fascinating topic, and perhaps more fascinating right now because I fear
Mm,
that we are in the throes of a fairly ugly, um, I guess, retaliation against migration, which is suddenly being called mass migration. And
mm,
there's a real resurgence of white nationalism, which, the last time we saw a resurgence of white nationalism, it definitely resulted in the White Australia policy, which is, probably one of the most shameful parts of our entire history. But again, it also came out of, in many ways, it came out of, well, came out not just purely out of Chinese people and their emergence
mm,
post the gold rush, but also the particularly subaltern people and Indians coming in through the shipping industry, and there was this kind of fear that people were going to take over. So it's fascinating that suddenly we have again that kind of really what I would call ugly rise of nationalism. I found writing about that book was a very challenging thing to be doing right now when we're witnessing kind of it's not just in Australia, but globally, this real retaliation against people from multi-racial backgrounds, which is kind of
mm.
deeply disturbing, to be perfectly honest.
No, I agree. I had a bit of a moment of existential doubt when I was preparing this. I was thinking, here I am writing and talking about gardens as a lovely metaphor for multicultural context. We've got, Nazis parading in the streets and
Mm.
people calling for the end to immigration and that sort of thing. But I mean, um, Leonie and we were sort of talking before I started the talk about metaphors and the importance of metaphors as a way of mapping our thinking, of understanding the world. So I guess that's how I reassured myself that what I was
Yeah,
doing is still valuable, because it gives a way of thinking about things, which is hopefully, I don't want to overstate my influence, but hopefully an opportunity to change how people think about things.
yeah, absolutely. I
Mm,
mean, I was actually I'm just talking to someone today, and they were saying that there's all sorts of research that says that people that do gardening on a regular basis are, are much healthier and more well adjusted. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty good to me. I recently had the opportunity to revisit one of my favorite museums in the world, which is the Asian Civilizations Museum in
yeah.
Singapore. And whenever I go to Singapore, if I get the opportunity, I love to visit. And the shipwrecks there that are, well, the very famous shipwreck exhibition that's there, they've done some very clever staging Now, of course, this material has been removed of all of its, accretions, but they display the pottery and the ceramics on these long, thin, uh, clear perspex, and they have them at differing heights. So they sort of mimic, they really do mimic the ocean floor. And I find it quite breathtaking. It's very evocative. But this one that you've just put up here, which I had not seen before, but I'm really fascinated by the idea that it's been called a sculpture, as we would have the
Mm,
you know the tide and the accretions that go on in within the ocean have somehow played an artistic role in the production of this, which challenges. I mean, I think you made a comment something like it was in relation to plants, but nature and culture, and I
mm,
personally, because I do so much work with communities, and spend a lot of time with communities. I mean, my argument is there's no such thing as nature. It's just,
mm,
what we might call nature is by other people, it can be kin, it can be family, it can be anything. It's actually, quite literally, no such thing as nature. Tell
mm.
me about this. Tell us about this amazing natural phenomena, this natural sculpture.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the thing, is that um, these sea sculptures kind of break down those artificial boundaries that we put between nature and culture, or what archaeologists call artifacts and ecofacts,
Mm.
when they're separating things out in their digs. Um, and Killian Quigley has written a lot about these sea sculptures, and about shipwrecks, and about how that term sculpture, when applied to something like this, really hopefully makes people think about what a sculpture is, or what human intervention is, or working with materials, working with natural things, as well as the fact that it forms over such a slow expanse of time. So I think this one, what was it, 500 years of just slow concretion, with things gently fusing together, and living, and working it into their world. And yeah, it makes us think in different ways, I guess, about artistic practice and the limits of what artistic practice or creative practice is. Is it something that humans alone do, or is it something that marine life can do as well? Or are we just being anthropomorphic when we apply that to
Well,
them? I don't know. It's
I feel like
interesting.
No,
I must.
because, and I also loved it's not just marine life. You also mentioned entropy, like non-living
Mm.
forces can also have a part to play in these sculptures.
Yeah, I was just
No,
thinking, sorry
definitely.
to just jump in, but also time. Like, I was thinking about how
Mm.
the ocean is, and currents are the unseen artistic hand, like the ocean itself is the artist, but it's also
Mm.
time, the passage of time that
Mm.
is essential for this. Like it takes hundreds of years. And for those here who haven't seen one of these sea sculptures with your own eyes, it's one thing to look at an image, but I still remember my first, which was at the Hong Kong Maritime Museum, and just standing there with, my jaw dropped when I saw it. But I got this sense of the ocean as an artist, but time
Mm.
and the hidden hand of, temporality that is essential. This can't happen without the passage of time. So yeah,
I
Yeah,
should
fascinating.
note, I can't actually see anyone other than Alex. I don't know if that's a problem with me, but so if other people are trying to talk, I can't see you until you start to speak. But I would love to just point out, Alex, that David Howarth, who you have met, who's a crucial member of our team, his PhD thesis was on the, in a sense, David, why don't you say it? It's the art of nature, but
yeah.
you
It was
jump
about
in.
like the idea that art can exist or art can be perceived outside of the human species. Um,
Ah.
and yeah, I was kind of wading into those debates that you sort of mentioned about are we actually seeing like art beyond the species, or are we projecting it, or is it a combination of the both? Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I should read your thesis.
And
Yes, I can send it to you.
the plan is for it to be published as a book, I might add.
Ah,
So
oh, good.
that's the next step. Look, we're right on the hour and we've got a couple of little things, announcements to make. So I'd just like to say, Alex, just thank you so much. That was utterly fabulous. I really enjoyed it a great deal. And I now need to get myself to Canberra to see this exhibition. So that's one thing. So thank you. People are applauding. Thank you. A couple of announcements here. We have an exhibition opening next month, and Guan Wei and others are going to be in that exhibition. It's an amazing exhibition. David's just put the link in the chat. I hope people can come. It will be on until the 6th of December. And then after that, it's traveling on to Perth at the Perth Institute. Is it
Perth
Institute
Institute of Contemporary Art.
Contemporary Art? Thank you. That's great. We've then got a couple more seminars this year. We have one in October. We haven't secured the date because it's a little bit of a moving feast because of travel. But we're going to have Paul Tayson speak. Then we have actually got this online nailed down, and that's Natalie Pearson. Natalie, whose PhD was actually talking about the Belatongue shipwreck that I mentioned before, which is currently on display, it's permanent display at the Asian Civilizations Museum. So that'll be fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that. And on Monday, the 1st of December, we're having an Australian Encounters Symposium. We've linked up with people at University of Western Australia who've been working on the VOC in Australia. We're going to have a one-day symposium. I just this week organised for us to make sure that it's also available by Zoom. That's not currently on the Eventbrite link, but it will be. And if you can't find it, email me or David. We will work it out and we'll make sure that you get the details because not everyone can make their way to Western Australia. So I think that's all our messages for tonight. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along. Alex, I greatly appreciate it. And I'd also have to mention that I greatly appreciate the chapter that you've contributed to the Palgrave book, which is quite a massive volume. So once it's out, we shall celebrate that with a big book launch, of course, to which you will all be invited. So thank you very much, Alex, and best of luck.
Thanks, Lynette.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Bye-bye.